Well, welcome everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending what time zone you're in. This is the third of a five-part series we're doing on access control testing, combining the use of SafePass software and the ERP Armor rule set from ERP Risk Advisors. So hopefully there are some folks joining, maybe perhaps that haven't been part of the prior webinars. And hopefully there's some people that have gotten a lot of the first couple that also are participating in this webinar. So I'm excited about this topic. It's a really complex topic for ERP Cloud, which is the patch cycle or the patch change management process. We're going to certainly talk about access controls. I'm going to weave in a couple other topics adjacent to access controls. And then I'm excited for Bob later to show some of the functionality within SafePass that helps companies manage change and identify and manage change as part of the quarterly patch process. So with that, we're going to get started. So I added a slide in. So if you're interested in CPE, CPE is available. So EP Risk Advisors will be happy to provide you continuing education. You must be in the session for at least 50 minutes, which is a requirement. And then we'll have to manually generate those certificates. So if you want to get CPE for this, please send an email to support@erpra.net and we'll reply back once we generate that certificate for you. This will qualify you for 1 hour CPE. So some prerequisites we have a couple of pre-recorded webinars that we've done over time. The first one, custom roles, data security policies, privileges, is a webinar that Donna Curtis did. She's the ERP Cloud practice manager on our team. And that is a good deep dive into what roles are and the components of roles. We as ERP Risk Advisors have been doing quarterly webinars on the patch release. So we've done for the last two patches, 23A and 23B. Currently working through 23C right now in terms of analyzing the impact of that. I'm guessing we'll come out with a webinar. We haven't planned it yet, but be on the lookout for that following our page on LinkedIn. And then if you haven't been a part of the first two webinars of this series, Emma could give you the link or enroll you in those recorded GoToMeeting recordings, part 1 and part 2. I'm going to cover some of the things in some respects at a very, very high level we covered in part 1 and part 2, but it's definitely worth going through those as well and revisiting some of the topics we've covered in the last two sessions. So the agenda here, I'm going to cover some highlights just briefly from the OATUG webinar from February 2023. So I'm part of the ERP Cloud SIG board. I'm the vice president and for OATUG, and that SIG, the purpose is to educate people on risks and functionality and so on related to ERP Cloud. So I thought I'd bring some of that in because it's give a little more context on what's happening from a patch perspective beyond just what we talk about typically in this series is security and controls. So I'll cover a couple of things there. I'm going to revisit the concept of what are SOD conflicts and sensitive access, but much more briefly than I've covered in the prior sessions. Talk about ERP Armor and give some more use cases of what we do in ERP Armor, the rules, some more specifics than I've covered in a couple of the last sessions. So there's going to be some new material there. Always like to talk about how to scope the rules, how you're presenting, the in-scope activities tied to your risk and control matrix. I'm going to cover briefly that. We cover that much more extensively in the last couple of webinars. And I'm going to dive into the meat of this, which is the patch impact analysis process. So for those of you that are not familiar with OATUG, it is an independent users group. So it stands for Oracle Applications and Technology Users Group. And if your organization is not a member, I would highly recommend being a part of that. There's some good training that happens throughout the year, like our special interest group, which is referred to as a SIG. We do monthly training sessions or learning sessions about different aspects of the applications. A lot of it is, well, I mean, all of it's really relevant if you're running ERP Cloud. Let's just say it that way. We cover just a lot of different topics. So that's available to members. And then there's an annual conference that I know SafePass attends as well. We just did that conference in June in Orlando, and it's a great opportunity to go to meet not only with vendors but to make connections with other end user organizations, to network and to provide good feedback and case studies and all those type of things. So hopefully your organization is a part of OATUG. It's a good investment, and this webinar, I think it's only available to members, but I can pass on the link to that if you're a OATUG webinar. I looked on the website this morning. It really wasn't that easy to find this link. So I've got the link here in the slides. So if you get copies of the slides at the end and you want slides, you can either request that from us, or Emma can provide that at SafePass. So there's the link where this is available. And effectively in this webinar, I interviewed two people that have been live, two organizations have been live for a long time. And the short version of what we covered was kind of 3 topics: what was presented by the SI to them, and then I'll go through the other 2 topics here in a second. But a lot of times when you're implementing ERP Cloud, you don't get a lot of information from the SI. Their focus is not post go live and long-term support. Their focus is just getting the applications up and running, meeting your objectives, and getting you through the process of going live. So there isn't a lot of feedback typically by SIs. This is something that's left to us as practitioners, using software like SafePass to be able to test some of the components of that. We'll dive into that. But effectively, a lot of organizations feel like they're in the blind. They don't really have a good understanding of what that quarterly patch process was. So what's presented by the SI, they say test everything, regression testing, which is a good topic to discuss, but they don't have a whole lot to offer beyond that. So some of the early challenges that organizations faced as it relates to once they've gone live, this was the meat of that webinar. I'm not going to go through all these details, but I'll just present a couple things here, highlight a couple things here that was discussed. Test scripts, the completeness of those test scripts is critical, and in theory, you should have complete test scripts coming out of your UAT cycle, or your go live, your go live of the system that as provided by the SI. But there are changes on an ongoing basis. So Oracle's introducing new functionality on a patch by patch basis, and there may be new functionality you implement that wasn't part of the project, but's being done internally. So there is maintenance that has to happen on those test scripts, and the big challenge, of course, is how to execute the test scripts. And so for those that aren't familiar with the patch cycle, Oracle patches in your non-production, your dev environment, and on one weekend, and 2 weekends later, so 2 weeks later, that patch is applied to production. So it's a very, very tight window. Other applications providers like Workday and NetSuite, for example, provide a longer window of testing. Oracle's testing window is pretty tight. It is quarterly, and it's mandatory. So effectively, you have to have a process of evaluating and understanding the impact of the patch and responding to that, whether it's a configuration change or a security change, as we're going to talk about in more detail as we go throughout this webinar. So README files are often not complete. Sometimes they're not accurate. The challenge really is just to align your staffing resources internally and prioritizing those with other company objectives. So this has to be the priority for everybody that's involved. So it's the functional end users that are testing the applications, reconfirming that there's been no degradation of the functionality, or everything's working effectively. So that's a big part of it, is having a staff and time to test and prioritizing those versus other objectives. There's this concept of cohorts. So you have a first an A, B, and a C cohort. An A cohort group go get their patch in the first month of the quarter, and then the B in the second month, the C in the third month. So the challenge really there is for organizations that are in the first cohort, the A cohort, the first month of the quarter, often that becomes a challenge to get through the testing cycle and evaluation with other things like month-end and year-end close processes and audit processes. So that is definitely a very important consideration for companies that are going live, is what cohort cycle they're going to be on, and whether they can align the resources with the A cohort cycle if they so choose. Data's masking in dev, so there's definitely some organizations when they clone prod to dev, they'll mask some data since the security is often not um, quite as secure, if you will, in the non-production environment. Usually, more people have access to more things, and we'll be given things like IT security manager in the non-production environment, where they wouldn't have that in a production environment. So, how to execute certain test scripts when data is changed. Um, One other comment: instance strategy is really critical. Like how you really should be scheduling out your clone of your production to test or production to dev clone process for years in advance, a year plus in advance, usually, to make sure that Oracle's doing the clones in the dev environment so it's most reflective of production when it's appropriate. So that's kind of an art, if you will, to making sure your patch cycle gives you the ability to test things most effectively. What most organizations are doing is evaluating the current functionality they have. They're just making sure that they can do all the major processes. So they're going through the key regression testing aspect in that 2-week window, and they're not deciding to implement any new features. So some features are automatic, and some features you have to opt into. So that's an evaluation of the READMEs and the other information provided to be able to understand what is it we have to do versus what are the things we can defer after the patch is applied in production. We stabilize and then decide throughout the rest of that quarter. So if you think of a quarter as being 12 weeks or 3 months, you have 2 weeks where you're testing the patch cycle or the patch before it goes into production, and then you have about 10 weeks to be able to decide what goes in from that patch or from prior patches. So going through the testing process and rolling that into production would be the critical aspect of that 2-week window. And last but not least, we're going to talk about evaluating security and the roles impacted by the patch. That's really the big emphasis on this particular webinar. So those are some of the early challenges organizations faced that had to figure some of those things out. And the two speakers gave me these 4 best practices. We talked about adopting any new functionality as much as possible. Make sure test scripts are updated each quarter as changes in functionality, new functionality is implemented. Make sure your clone from prod to dev is applied and reflects production data. And then just make sure that that you have the coordinated the period opening closing for testing and testing the period close process. So those are some of the best practices presented by Ravi and Brian in that webinar. So now, kind of diving into the topic, I want to again kind of paint some more background as it relates to what we're trying to accomplish when a patch is applied. So what we're focusing really on primarily in this topic is going to be the changes to security. But SafePass definitely has functionality beyond just the changes to security. So they have the ability to monitor changes to configurations as well. And so we're going to talk about that and to see a demo from Bob on that later. But I want to cover some of the material that we talked about earlier in the first 2 webinars, but contextualize these more with the impact from a patch perspective. So we talk about the types of risks that need to be monitored. It's not just compliance risk. People think, Sarbanes-Oxley, and that is important if you are a publicly traded company or preparing to go public. You're subject to SOX, JSOX, UK SOX, or other type of regulations. But there are other things that should be monitored as well: fraud, operational risk, cyber risk. I'll talk about that in a second. The impact from the licensing perspective, and then in general, IT general controls. So whereas when people think about security, often they're thinking about compliance and really the CFO or the CIO really being in charge of those aspects. But there are various different risks. I mean, effectively, the whole C-suite really should care about the impact of the patch. You have the CFO looking at compliance and fraud and potentially cybersecurity risks, but then you have the CIO looking at all risks, including licensing. You have the CISO that would be looking at cyber risks. You have a SOX organization that's really part of the overall control environment. Then you have the COO looking at it from an operational perspective. So there's more risk beyond just the typical, we've got to check the box and make sure our external auditors are happy from a compliance perspective. I was really excited to see SafePass come out with this article, and I'm going to just point to it just briefly. Webinar they just put out was talking about safeguarding the digitally connected world, why you should prioritize API security. I'm tying this, I would recommend you go to their LinkedIn page and look at this article in detail. We have a lot of focus on APIs and web services as part of our rule set. CRP Armor Rules covers those things, and we're going to cover a couple of specific examples. I decided to throw these in since SafePass just came out with this great article, and it's really a very timely topic as it relates to the SEC guidance on cybersecurity that just came out the last couple of weeks, and how management is evaluating their response, the disclosure response related to their cyber awareness and potential breaches if they have any, hopefully not. So I would point you to this article to read, and it's a great article giving you some context regarding APIs and the importance of security around those, not only security, but the activity as well. So I want to then next really go through and define the last couple of webinars. I've really talked a lot about the maybe potentially overemphasis on SOD conflicts and underemphasis on sensitive access risks. So to make sure that kind of we're all on the same page, a lot of people think about access control risk in the context of SOD or segregation duties, which is the combination of two things, like the ability to enter and maintain suppliers, ability to enter and maintain payables, invoices, or purchase orders. And those are important from a compliance risk, and there are certain elements like overriding controls and journal entry controls and fraud elements that are wrapped into that. But what the industry as a whole, I'm using air quotes, that looks at access controls often really underestimates or under tests, if you will, is the concept of sensitive access risks. And those are risks in and of themselves. Examples of here: vendor master maintenance, purchase orders, ability to provision users, ability to maintain roles. And it really is not just vendor master maintenance or purchase orders, but we talk about, just tying it back to the article, it is vendor master maintenance as it's done through the user interface, through the front end of the application, and it's vendor master maintenance that potentially can be done through APIs or web services. So it's really kind of two subsets of risk, those that are subject to the approval process, the normal approval process like workflow, and that those that are not subject to workflow approval process. So although you can argue vendor master maintenance is one risk in total from a practitioner's perspective, when you're looking at like auditors and IT compliance and both internal and external auditors, often what they're really focusing on is what's happening through the front end of the application. So who has the ability to enter a vendor or maintain a vendor through the user interface or through pages and forms, as we talk about in ERP Cloud, and is the workflow set up appropriately to make sure that the person that enters it cannot also approve their data entry. So that's kind of the common SOD that it's everybody's looking for, is the separation of the entry of a transaction or master data from the approval of that. Having said that, and kind of tying it back to the article that SafePass just came out with on the APIs, is there are APIs, there are web services, there are FBDI abilities which would not be subject to the workflow approval process. And so in terms of from a security design and auditing from a security perspective, you need to make sure that you're looking at both of those risks. I'll go through some examples here. So what I always say is we should be looking at sensitive access risk first and segregation duties second. So if you look at SOD first, and you're looking at like who has the ability to enter suppliers, enter payables, invoices, and let's say there's a problem with security, and somebody has the ability to enter suppliers that shouldn't. So that would cause, let's say an AP clerk has been granted access to that when an AP clerk shouldn't. It should be like a master data group or a separate supplier group that does supplier master maintenance. So what we would say is look at this, the master data in particular first, and resolve whether or not the access controls within that process are properly defined. So we look at sensitive access risks first, and if there's inappropriate access to suppliers, resolving those things. Then we're going to look at the combination of that, enter suppliers and enter payables invoices, or enter suppliers and purchase orders. Part of what we have to do, and back to my point in the prior slide, is what we have to do is evaluate, is the access giving them kind of back-end access, web services, APIs, FBDI abilities, a spreadsheet upload processes, or are we looking at it just from a front-end perspective? And you really should be looking at it from both perspectives. You could have somebody that has an FBDI ability to enter and maintain suppliers or bank accounts, that could either set up a fictitious supplier or make a change to an existing supplier that's fraudulent. And then they would have access to enter payables invoices, and that could be front-end access that is available through or governed through a workflow process, or it could be back-end access again, like there's certain import processes that are not subject to the approval workflow when implemented. So it's, before we even get into the SOD, the testing, if you will, from an access control perspective, you should have a good understanding of what objects are governed by workflow and which ones are not, and then whether the workflow process has been approved appropriately, and that is by design typically segregating the entry of a transaction from the approval of a transaction. So what we do, our product is called the ERP Armor. It is what we call risk content. It's a series of SOD and sensitive access rules that we do update patch over patch. So if you subscribe to our rules and you use SafePass software, what you're going to get is an always updated process. You have software that's continually being enhanced. You're going to have the risk content or the rules continually enhanced as well, at a fairly cheap price relative to having to do that internally, which often organizations don't have the resources that or the time to be able to do that with internal resources, or to hire a risk advisory firm to do that. So effectively what we've done through the subscription of ERP Armor is we've productized into a fairly cost-effective subscription on an annual basis that gives you updates on a recurring basis as the applications are patched. So for ERP Cloud, there's 4 patches a year. What our team does is we evaluate the impact of those patches, and for our customers that are subscribing or using software like SafePass, then we're providing updates to the content. So as that patch rolls into production, and you're running an analysis that we're going to talk through a little bit later, then you're going to be able to evaluate the risk as of that patch level and not be 2 or 3 or 4 quarters behind. The traditional model of quote unquote refreshing the rules is bringing in a risk advisory firm or one of the big 4 companies that do this on a periodic basis, and that becomes a fairly costly project. I mean, you're not going to probably have a project for less than $50,000 at any given point in time. So it's costly. You may not be doing that you certainly wouldn't be doing that every quarter. Maybe do that once a year. Well, if that's the case from a cloud applications perspective, you could be 3 or 4 quarters behind, and you could have been living with risks introduced into those roles for multiple quarters. So what management really should be doing is evaluating those risks on a quarterly basis. So as we're going to look in this patch impact process, that would mean get our using SafePass software, updating the rules as part of that quarterly patch process, and running those and being proactive at addressing any new risks that are introduced during the patch cycle or potentially right after things roll into production. So ERP Armor rules consist of privileges mapped to sensitive access risks, duty roles. There are cases where certain duty roles are a shell, so they don't have privileges within them that can be looked at from a risk perspective. So we have to look at the duty role itself, and then data security policies, which are basically like column level attribute mapping that further refines security, and a lot of those are used for column level security and PII like PI, PHI, GDPR type access. So that's all part of role design as well that should be tested. And then of course, everybody knows what SOD risks are. Those are pairs of sensitive access risks. As we looked at examples, enter suppliers, enter AP invoices or purchase orders as common examples. So in the last couple webinars, I didn't dive into a lot of detail on some examples, and I'm gonna talk through some examples here and offer those that are attending maybe some free resources for a couple of areas. And the first one that we're willing to share with the participants today is this concept of create manual SLA journal entries. And there's a similar risk if you're coming from eBusiness Suite moving to ERP Cloud. There's a similar risk in a function that it was an article we wrote called the one function that allows users to bypass journal approval controls. There's actually kind of two different privileges in ERP Cloud that have a similar risk. And so what we're talking about here is the way somebody can enter a journal entry that's not subject to the journal approval workflow. So the typical control for journal entries focuses on the design of the journal approval workflow, such that, like I said before, you got to verify that nobody can enter and post the same journal entry. You have a similar risk with both of these we call create manual SLA journal entry privileges. And we have an article on this, so if you're interested in an article, I'm going to cover this just briefly, but we have a full article that goes into this in more detail. So you're welcome to email us at support@erparea.net, and we'll send you this article back. So just briefly, override subledger journal entry. If a journal entry is coming in from a subledger, like payables, for example, and you identify that that's hitting a wrong account, the traditional way of handling this is you do a reclass entry, a manual reclass entry that would move the balance from the account it shouldn't be in to the account it should be in. So effectively, we could be moving it from an expense account to another expense account in a different department, or we could be moving from the balance sheet account to the income statement account, or income statement account to the balance sheet account. The ability to move a balance in that way could provide somebody the ability to quote unquote manipulate financial statements results. So like if there was a large sales balance that came in as an example, and that's coming in from the AR module, and it was $500,000, somebody could go into this and say, I want to move that sales balance to the balance sheet, so it's no longer on the sales. I've just basically removed sales for the quarter or for the period that would quote unquote manipulate financial results. It's really the purpose and intention of SOX. So this functionality, when you do the override, it does a reclass entry, and the reason this is used is it retains the link between the subledger activity and the general ledger. So the functionality is enhanced. So in the prior traditional way of handling this, before this functionality was implemented, you did a reclass entry, and then so the reclass entry didn't continue that link to the subledger detail. So the drill down from the general ledger back into the subledgers. So this functionality retains that link, if you will. So because it's a subledger journal entry, when the reclass entry is done, the subledger journal entry is not going to be set up to go through journal approval workflow in what's called the journal sources configuration. So this reclass entry that is built uses the same source, and that same source then not being subject to the journal approval workflow, that effectively gives them the ability to create it like a manual journal entry, but that manual journal entry is not subject to the journal approval workflow process. So there's some controls that management needs to think about, like do I even have this functionality available to my team? And if I do, how do I make sure that I can communicate to the auditors that these type of journal entries have been reviewed and approved and are appropriate, just like a manual journal entry would be. The next one here is very similar. The only difference is it's called manage subledger journal entry manually, and it's like the risk in EBS is that you can choose any source. So when you're doing uploading a journal entry, you can choose the source, and that source then you could choose one that's not subject to the journal approval workflow. So that's really the same risk as in EBS. I'm going to cover this whole FBDI, ADFDI journal entries. In a little bit, we're going to talk about one of the changes that was implemented in 22B. And so I'll pass on kind of making those comments for now, but we're going to talk about journal entries again here in a minute. I want to head on a couple other topics, and one in particular is something that was addressed by SafePass in that most recent article, which is API access. So I'm just clicking on a link here, and I've got this link open, and I want to go back through one of the kind of the bigger things that we've got accomplished with Oracle on what's called Customer Connected. For not familiar with this, this is where enhancements requests are filed and evaluated, and then eventually put into place. So there's a voting process that happens. So in 2021, so a couple years ago, after remediating this consistently with our clients, so effectively what we found in this was the ability to commit what we would call material fraud in the employee role. And so we logged an enhancement request June 2021, and it took about 2 years, I think, for this to get implemented. I think this was delivered in, no, it was a year and a half. December 2022, I think, is when this was delivered. And that role had at the time, the employee role, the import supplier bank account, which is an FBDI privilege that allows somebody to create a new bank account associated and set it as its default associated with any given supplier. So it's an FBDI process that's used for converting suppliers. So the conversion process is you convert the supplier, and then you convert the bank account related to that supplier as the second step. And that's this import supplier bank account process. Incidentally, as we work through this process, there are other things that became problematic. So this FSCM load interface administration duty role was something else that was removed. And then I think as Oracle evaluated this, there was also, I'm just maybe confusing my issues a little bit, but this REST API, this Access REST FSCM integration REST service, which is the mega API for the financials and supply chain area. And I think it was in that role at the time it came out, but I do know that this REST API is in a lot of end user seated roles. And the confusing part about the APIs, and when you're looking at security as a whole, is asking the question, are APIs necessary for the user interface functionality to work? And for the financials and supply chain side, the answer is no. It gets a lot more complicated because in the HCM side, the API access is needed for the UI to work, or some APIs are needed. So this is the art of role design, and why our team is so specialized in this area, because that's the nuance of how do we build roles that are least privileged but don't have something beyond what they need. So that would be, I'm just kind of tying this back into exactly what SafePass said in the article. API access is critical to test and really should be only assigned where needed, which generally speaking is going to be just integration users. So I'm gonna move on. We're running a little bit longer on time. And I'm just gonna touch on some other areas. I talked about the concept of in-scope rules in the last 2 webinars in a lot of detail. What are the driving forces behind access control testing? It's much more than just compliance. It's cyber, it's data security, it's fraud. And in the next topic, in the next session, we're going to cover the how to test for the independence of the control performer. This is one of the 10 different scenarios we're covering in this topic, and I covered in this webinar series. I covered. Let me go back to my slides open here. I covered this. How to determine what rules are relevant pretty extensively in the first 2 webinars. So it's what we call evaluating what's our in-scope rules. So well, from a compliance perspective, what rules should we be evaluating SSD and sensitive access? From a cyber perspective, what rules should we be evaluating, primarily looking at sensitive access risk and so on. But one of the next webinar we're doing is going to be talking about testing the independence of the control performer, which is a massive gap in the external audit community that is not being really evaluated by internal auditors or management. So I'm kind of urging you to sign up for the next couple series, the training sessions, because I'm going to talk about this in more detail. And I'll just reemphasize, as SafePass did in their article, you also need to look at things that bypass typical workflow: APIs, web services, data conversion processes, Excel upload processes like HCM data loader, and then customizations when you're talking about on-prem systems, so like EBS or SAP or other applications. So now into the meat of really what we're going to talk about today. I'm going to try to throw in a second topic if we have time, but really what I want to focus on is the patch change management. This is the series, the 10 different scenarios that we're covering. We've covered role design, provisioning, user access reviews, role change management. We're going to be covering patch change management and development change management. And then with the next two series, webinars this series, we're going to look at cyber incidents, testing independence of control performance, look back procedures, and license exposure. So patch change management, I talked about the webinar, the OETG webinar. It's a full webinar. I would recommend going back and listening to that. It's a very complicated topic, especially if you're not on the operational side, if you're more on the audit side and trying to understand what should I be auditing. There's a lot more than I can cover in this topic. We're really just going to hit on a couple of topics and look at some functionality that SafePass has. I want to bring this, one of the precursors we talked about, or the prerequisites to this webinar, was the 23B webinar. And I wanted to just briefly touch on this to recommend that you go back and look at the webinar we talked about. And I got to find the right one. So it really covered this enhancement request that had been out there for a very long time. So it was originally filed in September 2020, and it was over 2 years. The fix was just put out in 22B. And the irony of this, there's so much I'd love to cover on this topic, but effectively prior to 22B, the same risk we talked about, which is the ability to use any source when you're determining what journal entry to be able to implement, that risk existed for every account. So any accountant that had ADFDI abilities, which typically is a manual journal entry process with a source of spreadsheet, any account that had that permission, that privilege to be able to do ADFDI journal entries, which is every accountant in the world would have. That's the only way to do journal entries. They also had the ability to bypass the journal approval workflow by using an FBDI template. And the FBDI template could choose any source. So ADFDI is defaulted to spreadsheet source, which would be typically configured to go through the journal approval workflow. FBDI journal entries allows you to choose any source, like a subledger source, like payables we talked about, that would not be subject to the journal approval workflow. So that gap was out there, and I can argue, because of the lack of look back procedures, every organization that was running ERP Cloud probably at the very least should have had a significant deficiency. In most cases, if they didn't really understand how to perform look back procedures and get comfortable that that hadn't been used, should have probably had a material weakness. So, and I don't use the MW word lightly. It is legit. I've talked to people about this, and to the extent the reason external auditors hadn't really understood this risk is kind of beyond me, to be honest. In this case, the gentleman that put forth this idea request was a Deloitte employee. So at the very least, Deloitte as an organization should have known that this was a massive gap in design that should have potentially required a significant deficiency, if not a material weakness. So make a long story short, there was a fix to this that was finally introduced in 23B. And so if you're interested in that webinar, there is, on our website, you can go into our learning platform. You can see what's new in 23B webinar. This is a free 1-hour CP class, and there's a bunch of other free webinars beyond this I talked about. 23A as well, the one that Donna has, the custom roles. So those are 3 hours of CPE in and of themselves. That gives you some context of understanding roles, and in particular, understanding the context of this 23B change in ADFDI, FBDI ability. So I would encourage you to go back and go through that. And the fix did not automatically apply to your general ledger roles. So if you are thinking the patches, the fix was applied by Oracle, so now we're not at risk still from an audit perspective, that's not the case. The fix was applied, but it wasn't was implemented, but it wasn't associated or applied to the general ledger accountant or the general ledger manager role, the typical 2GL roles that would be used to do journal entries. So if you haven't applied that fix that we talked about in this webinar, you should go back, listen to the webinar, and apply that fix to, but if you're using seated roles, you're in trouble, right? Because you can't apply a fix to a seated role. You'd have to customize those roles, which you should anyways. You should be using all custom roles. You shouldn't be using any seated roles. Another long topic. I'm going to move on from there. So now we're looking at patch change management and specifically what to do. And from where we're looking at purely from an access control perspective, let's assume you've got SafePass, you've got that software implemented. What do you need to do with SafePass and ERP Armor to identify the impact of those changes from a security perspective? So now we're drilling in right into security. So if to the extent that there are new security objects deployed, so I'm talking about privileges, duty roles, and data security policies, those are the security objects, then the rules that you're using in SafePass to test access controls need to be updated. And that's exactly what we do in ERP Armor. We provide you those updates based upon our research. So the nice thing is you don't have to have the expertise internally to do this. We're doing this on behalf of all of our customers, and that, frankly, we get feedback from customers and questions on an ongoing basis. We have some managed services customers, so we're always staying on top of these topics. So it's kind of like it is a village that participates in this process. But effectively, what we do is our own research, and we come out with what new security objects need to be deployed. And it could be that even the existing objects have a change to the risk ranking. So like that is, or risk description that we put into that. So that should be part of what you're doing. And if you're not doing that on a quarterly basis, then effectively you are putting your organization at risk for not addressing those issues in a timely manner. If you found out about those issues a quarter or 2 quarters later, then you would have to do look-back procedures, looking back at what the potential impact on that vulnerability being there for a period of time before you remediated it. So you also, there may be new roles that have either been introduced or updated as part of the patch. So for the new roles that are introduced, you should ask yourself the question, should they be assigned? So this is thinking about your user provisioning process. Are the new roles in and of themselves least privileged? Are they, do they have any things in them that they shouldn't, right? So this is the whole concept of we talked about in the role design, role change management process. And last, how do you attest to make sure that new roles that are being introduced are available to be assigned least privileged, no more, no less? Should you customize those roles? In most cases, the answer is going to be yes. There are reasons to customize that role because it has more things than it should. And if you're using either seated roles or what we call hybrid roles, which is a custom role that has seated components within them, then there are potentially changes to those roles being introduced as part of your patch that are already assigned to users. So what we would say is you need to reevaluate sensitive access risk. So your rules are updated. You rerun the sensitive access analysis on all your roles and say, did the patch add any new sensitive access risk in the roles that we need to pull out of the roles, or we need to customize a role that we haven't customized before? And then has the change to the role granted access to the abilities being reviewed by the control performer? So we're going to talk about that in the next session. Are the people that are monitoring controls, are they being given something new to them that undermines their independence as the control performer? So I'm gonna talk about that a lot in the next webinar. And then we have SOD conflicts must be reevaluated. Has a change to the role, adding abilities, adding privileges, duty roles, or DSPs cause an SOD within that role or across roles? And then if you have mitigating controls that quote unquote are mitigating those risks, are they still in place? So what this comes down to is the same thing we talked about in the last webinar. From a sensitive access risk perspective, we're going to look at all the activities within a role and say, are those activities still appropriate, or are there new activities that are not appropriate? So we would look at potentially what we call a role pivot table, or we may look at the role object specifically. So these are the objects that are contained in the AP Invoice Supervisor. We're going to revisit whether or not there's any new objects that shouldn't be in there that would cause a security risk, compliance risk, cyber risk, data security risk, or operational risk, right? Think about all those objectives. So what we really want to do is run this same thing we talked about in the last webinar, a comprehensive sensitive access analysis. And we would do that through something we call our mega tag that looks at all sensitive access rules other than licensing, page abilities, and OBI duty roles. So that's what you're relying upon us is how do you have full risk coverage as you're doing that analysis. So you revisit that from a role perspective, and then you're going to rerun a full SOD analysis and make sure that when you think about the in-scope SOD rules, there are no new risks being implemented. And that I can almost tell you, like in every patch cycle, there is something being introduced that requires, even if you're using fully customized roles. So like when we work with customers, the end result of when we work with customers is there's no more seated roles assigned to anybody. There are risks in every seated role. There are no hybrid roles. There are no custom roles with seated duty roles within them, subcomponents of the roles. But even still, when we work with the clients that have fully customized roles, there's a reason to make a change to those roles. Like the 22B is a perfect example. There's often reasons to go make changes to those roles, but especially if you're in a hybrid role, a lot of organizations are in a hybrid role state. They maybe the SI did some customization to the roles, but they didn't fully customize those roles. Then maybe they're still using seated duty roles, or maybe even using some role inheritance. So a job role inheriting another role. So this is part of what we can help your organization do. We have training that goes through this process in detail, training specific to SafePass, how to use SafePass to be able to look at these abilities. And then we have full support during your patch cycle and after, as you guys have questions on, if you're looking at this, this detail here, these are specific privilege names within the role, and you're like, how can I possibly know what these privileges do? The answer is you don't have to. We've done that work for you. We have right now, I think 2,800 plus privileges, duty roles, and DSPs mapped to risk, and they're accurate. They're incredibly accurate. We've been doing this for 5+ years, building this rule set the way that we've been doing it, and you can rely upon what we're telling you. Like if we walk through this process and we say, okay, AP Invoice Supervisor, you need to remove imports payables invoice and import payables payment request. These are FBDI abilities that bypass the workflow. You can count on the fact that we've tested those, we've mapped those, and our information related to this is been validated by our customer base for many quarters. So incidentally, there's some good examples here. Those are FBDI privileges: import payables invoice, import payables payment request. And then manage subledger journal entry manually. That's what we talked about, is bypassing a journal approval workflows. That's in the AP Supervisor role. And then there's some web service and some other things you can see. There's a lot of things that should come out of this role. And in the second part 2 of the webinar, Bob took us through a process of how to run what we call rule tags and assessment via rule tags. And so I would invite you to go back and listen to that. What we have is what we call a mega rule tag, and that is what you would be used to evaluating those sensitive access risks and then SOD conflicts related to revalidating role design. We do update that on a quarterly basis. So like if you're a brand new customer of SafePass and you're going live while we're on 23C, we have a new import process that automatically has everything updated. If you are an existing SafePass customer and you have our rules, then we're going to give you an incremental change to that rules engine, if you will, that you can apply during your quarterly patch process. So the other thing we haven't really talked about yet, and I'm going to turn this over to Bob in a second here, is the impact of configurations. And there are lots of things you should be looking at from the way the application's working as part of the patch impact perspective. There are security objects. Part of that we're doing in the assessment of risk, but there are cases where you might want to run an impact between the ASC tables that contain the security. And there's a lot of other things that we haven't covered related to security here. Role delegation would be a good example, and some other things. So I'm going to turn this over to Bob now, and he's going to walk through a. Actually, I'm going to bring up a video. Is what we're going to do, and then Bob is going to. Let's see. He's going to talk through the video, and so what if analysis? Sorry, let me find the right video. There we go. So this is the patch impact analysis session, and I'll let Bob kind of walk you through what we're showing in this video.
Thanks, Jeff. What we're going to cover here is SafePass solutions for helping you monitor patch applications. And that's done with our Monitor Pass solution and Data Probe solution. Monitor Pass can run and check against the master data, configuration data, transactions also. So here we're going to drill down into the Monitor Pass application. And Monitor Pass allows you to add monitoring and compensating controls. We have a concept called object sets, and object sets where you define objects that you want to monitor with Monitor Pass. The configurations we're showing right here, record to report, these are all the ones that we have defined in our demo environment. As you can see, we've got journal sources, asset calendars, categories, and you can configure the objects that are important to you specifically based on risk. We're going to use journal sources in this particular example. And what you're looking at right now is a monitor. And the monitor has several different components to it. And if we scroll down, we can look at the different objects that are being monitored for journal sources. And you can configure these as you see fit. So it can be very specific to the information that you're looking to monitor when a patch is applied. And it's all automatic. It's pretty straightforward. You don't have to be a technician to use these capabilities. So if I scroll back up, we have a concept called snapshots and result sets. Snapshots is the raw data that's being extracted by Data Probe out of the ERP in the SafePass. When you run the monitor, it creates a result set. And the result set has filtering criteria. You can define what we call rule logic, so I can eliminate certain information based on a date, based on a user, based on whatever criteria I want to use. And it's, once again, rule logic is pretty straightforward. It doesn't require any scripting. It's all contextual. So if I look at the rule set, and the process for patching is you run a monitor against the configurations before you apply the patch, and that'll generate a rule set itself. Once the patch is applied, then you can run the monitor again. It'll create another result set. So you have two results set, one before and one after the actual patch is applied. And when you get to that's been completed, and time could be quick, could be lengthy, just depends on the number of configuration items that are being tracked. So now I want to look at result set, and I can do a comparison. So now what I'm doing is I'm comparing the before and after of the patch. And as you can see, we're picking two different rule sets. Once again, before and after. I could look at different records. So if a record has changed, I want to know about that change. I can look at what's missing from the rule set one. So if I have something that's added, I'll be able to see that what's added. And then also what's missing from rule set two, if that's the after patch, it'll identify those records that are missing from rule set two. So once again, this makes a pretty straightforward process for identifying the violations through the patch. Thank you.
Yep. Great job, Bob. Thanks for providing that. I think this is another key aspect of patch impact analysis is looking at the potential impact on anything you're relying upon from a configuration perspective, or any data for that matter that is being introduced. So another key aspect of compliance beyond security, we talked about security a lot, is looking more broadly at the way the configurations are impacted by the patch. And like we said, and emphasized by Robbie and Brian early on in this the webinar we did, you can't always rely upon the README files to be comprehensive, and so having a proactive approach of evaluating the potential impacts by using a tool like SafePass is really valuable to protect the integrity of your system in the long run. So that's kind of it from a patch perspective. I'm throwing in just quickly this one or two comments on what we call it development change management. It's really a similar process. The only difference is from a development, and when think about development change management, it could be in an so if you have an on-prem system, for like maybe you're here in your e-business suite and you're just looking at this a potential change to ERP Cloud in the long run, you're not there, or you're using another on-prem system. Whenever you're implementing new custom development within the application that gets moved into production, that those new security objects, so functions and concurrent programs in EBS, for example, then those should be mapped into your risk library and from an SOD and sensitive access perspective every time you're moving something into production. So that should be part of your change management process. If you are in ERP Cloud, there are risks. So a custom object in ERP Cloud would be potentially like registering a new report. So there are reports that potentially have risk. You're thinking, how can a report have risk? Well, a report can have risk because of PII. So if you're broadening your scope of not thinking about the insert, update, and delete aspect, or the compliance aspect, and you're thinking about data security, maybe you're a company based in the UK or a broader Europe that's subject to GDPR, and you need to make sure you have definitively evaluating who has access to PII. So it's not just the OBI or the access they're getting through the seeded objects. So the subject areas that give them the OBI access to run reports, but it's also then potentially like a new report that's being developed and rolled out by your BI admin team. So those are two different use cases, various different use cases for on-prem versus the ERP Cloud solution. So there's not a lot there. So I kind of want to throw this in at the end of the topic, and then that gives us the room to cover the next couple of topics in the next two webinar series. So in terms of next steps, if you are a SafePass customer and you're interested, maybe you're using. So we talked about ERP Cloud, but we actually have content for other applications. So pretty much everything that SafePass can do, Workday, NetSuite, and on all the on-prem systems, we have are a rule set for that as well. So a lot of this does apply to on-prem systems as well in terms of the impact of changes, role changes, the impact of patches, which are less frequent perhaps, but there's still going to be patches, and the impact of development. So we can work with your organization in both on-prem systems and SaaS applications using SafePass software to monitor these risks for all your applications. Register for the remaining two parts of the webinar series. The next one we're talking about cyber incident risk analysis, particularly important for management to have a plan when there is a breach, whether that's an on-prem system or a SaaS system like ERP Cloud. And there are definite cyber risks from not from a ransomware perspective, but think about more from a data security and a fraud perspective. And so we're going to cover that in the next one, and we're also going to cover the impact of the testing of independence and control performers. And then part 5, we're going to wrap up with looking at how to execute look-back procedures and license exposure. We do a monthly newsletter. You can sign up for that here. And then for those that are attending, I've talked about 3 classes that we have that are free, and that's part of the prerequisites. A 4th class we're willing to provide anybody that's attending this webinar is a class we have called Why Access Control Should Be Tested for All-in-Scope Systems. It's an hour and a half training class that's a $299 value. If you're interested in being enrolled in that, you can email us at support@erpra.net, and we'll enroll you in all 4 of those classes. So that's 4.5 hours of free CPE above and beyond the CPE you get for this class that we're doing today. Any other questions? You can, or contact information. Obviously, you've got Bob's, you've got Emma's, you've got SafePass contact information. If we can help you in any other way, you can check out our website. We have a very broad set of learning offerings above and beyond this. And then I've talked about ERP Armor rules. We also have an extensive pre-built library of custom roles that can be used to remediate your seated and hybrid roles and to get into a least privileged state. You can contact us about that as well by opening a ticket or sending me an email. So thanks for your time. I really hope to see you on the next series, and hopefully this was a valuable training class for you. Appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Bob. Appreciate it.